Welcome everyone to Nerd of the Rings. I am here at Dragonsteel Nexus in Salt Lake City talking with the famed Brandon Sanderson of the wonderful Cosmere, my latest obsession in the world of books. Brandon, thanks so much for taking the time out.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, I always like to start people off with the question, how were you first introduced to Tolkien?
So, I was introduced to Tolkien through The Hobbit. When I was like in 5th grade and 4th grade, I got into a big reading kick. And during that time, I read 2 fantasy novels. I don't count this as the start of but I read just as I was reading whatever people handed me.
Yeah.
And one was a Jane Yolen book.
Okay.
And one was The Hobbit. And I really liked The Hobbit. I really liked the Jane Yolen book too, Dragon's Blood, highly recommend. But I'm like, oh, if I like The Hobbit, I should read Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
I was not a great reader. I'm in 5th grade or 6th grade. I picked up Lord of the Rings and I bounced off hard.
Yeah.
Right? I think I got to the Barrow-wights. I'm not even sure. Yeah. Right? And I'm like, fantasy, books for, I didn't even think fantasy. I didn't know it was a genre. I'm like, books for big people are not for me. Is bouncing off of that. And it wasn't Tolkien's fault, but it was other things. People also gave me like, at that point, they're like, "Oh, you didn't like that? Here's where the wild fern grows, or here's Old Yeller." And I started reading a bunch of books that just didn't really work for me. I knew what it was like to be a kid living in kind of a rural area. I didn't need books about it, and so I fell out of reading during that era. And then I got back into it in 8th grade, so about 2-3 years later.
Yeah.
I had a teacher get me into fantasy novels with the Barbara Hamilton novel. And after I really did a deep dive back into fantasy, and I read Terry Brooks, and things like this, and of course Terry Brooks, I'm like, oh yeah, that Tolkien guy. Everybody loves Tolkien. And so when I was 18, I said, well, maybe I will like Lord of the Rings now, and I really loved it. By then, I'd become a good enough reader to appreciate the things that Tolkien was doing.
Yeah.
And with the kitty gloves being off from Hobbit to Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And so that was my first introduction to Lord of the Rings. Silmarillion, I did not read until I was in college, late college. Like we're talking like 10 years later. I'm like, all right, I call myself a fantasy fan. I've got to do it.
Yeah.
I've got to do it. And I'll be honest, Silmarillion was still hard.
Yeah.
I thought when I went to Silmarillion, I'd be like, it's kind of like when I read Lord of the Rings. I'm not. No, it was still kind of hard.
No, it is. Yeah.
It was still. Like I got through it and I appreciate it, and I really appreciate it now with all this, all the stuff that's happening. I know Rings of Power isn't technically allowed to do the Silmarillion,
right.
But at least I can talk intelligently when people are like, that's not how the Silmarils are actually supposed to be. I can be like, oh yes, as a person who has read the Silmarillion once and barely understood it, I totally agree and understand what so.
Can I say, as just a quick aside, that your reaction to Dan saying that he might give season 1 an 8 out of 10?
It became a meme.
Rings of Power is still a 7 or even an 8 out of 10? Because I love
8 out of 10.
I watch that sometimes. Just I might even have it saved on my phone, and I send it to people once in a while. It just gives me a good chuckle.
Yeah, I will admit I haven't been able to get myself to do season 2 yet.
I was
even
curious,
though largely people say season 2 is an improvement.
I think it is. I think it is. Yeah.
And like I always say to people, like, I love Next Generation Star Trek. Like, first season's rough, so give it to a second season.
Yeah.
I feel like I should be willing to do that for things like Rings of Power and whatnot. And I didn't hate Rings of Power.
Yeah.
You saw I gave it like a 6, I think.
That's what I gave it to.
Yeah,
actually.
was it?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
And so 6 is above average.
Yeah.
It was above average. The fact that it's being compared to a 10 in the films is maybe unfair to it.
Right.
But
yeah. Now, being a Tolkien fan and, encountering those books at a young age, especially Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, how do you feel those have influenced your own writing?
Yeah, so my kind of standard answer to this, which may be too glib and may not have enough nuance to it, but it makes a good soundbite, is I see myself as kind of a scholar of the fantasy genre, particularly epic fantasy, right?
Yeah.
The branch that came from Tolkien.
Yeah.
And I kind of view there being three main branches. There's the Howard heroic branch, which we see a lot of Michael Moorcock during the 70s and things like that. All of that kind of single character in a brutal world where magic is something to be afraid of, stuff, which kind of, I think Joe Abercrombie is kind of the modern kind of leader of that sort of thing, obviously. And then, I wouldn't say obviously. Obviously, that's one of the big lines, is what I'm saying. Then there's the Portal Fantasy line. Which is really starts with Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
It's kind of there's been Portal fantasies going. It's like the earliest of these genres. And then you have the Portal fantasies that obviously Harry Potter is the big Portal fantasy of this era, where it's person from our world, usually a kid, gets sucked into a fantasy world, and Narnia popularized that. Then we have epic fantasy, which really there are no precursors to unless you go to mythology. Like the precursors to Tolkien are Beowulf, rather than, you see a lot of fairy stories in the 1800s, and you see a lot of Portal, and you see a lot of I traveled to a mystical land, or this is from the prehistory of Earth, with that stuff. But Tolkien, it's really in this, the closest things they did are Beowulf and the Odyssey. And so seeing that as like the big, he really kicked off epic fantasy. Like, he is the epic fantasy. Obviously, he's the biggest name, but I think he's also the progenitor. And so I view epic fantasy in three basic generations so far. Because Tolkien really started epic fantasy with Lord of the Rings. And so it's a genre, it is the youngest of the three big fantasy genres. Obviously, there's urban fantasy that's straddling the line between fantasy and horror, so it's its own thing. But you can say urban fantasy goes back to Dracula and before to Frankenstein. So it's the youngest. And the big thing with Tolkien is he did something that no one had ever done before, which is really hard to do, Really, really hard to do, and that is true, complete secondary world fantasy. If you look at the early heroic fantasies, they all take place on our world. Conan is in our world just during the prehistory age. Narnia starts in our world. Wonderland starts in our world. And Tolkien is the first time we really see this is taken totally straight as a secondary world, even though it's Middle Earth, so it has some little roots, where he's like, I'm going to take it from Earth and make, this whole new mythology, this whole new lore. It is so well done that everybody by necessity spent a generation in its shadow. And the really cool epic fantasies that came out after that, I don't know how much you talk about these things online, but are things like Thomas Covenant, which is deeply Tolkien influenced. It's stuff like the Fionnuala Tapestry by Guy Gavriel Kay. Have you talked about him?
I know of him and have talked about his work with Christopher.
Do you know, as an aside, I could not get out of Guy Gavriel Kay how much he did on Silmarillion.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had dinner with him. I'm like, all right, tell me. He's like, I'm not.
All these years later.
He will not say a peep of what he did. I think
that's pushing like 50 years ago.
Yeah, I think he has too much respect for the whole thing. Who knows what he did? Like, I really want to know if he had to step in and finish some things, or what. Like, did he do for Silmarillion what I did for Wheel of Time? But he won't say a word. So,
man, that's one of those.
Yeah,
I think that's going to be an unsolved mystery, probably.
But even if we look at stuff like Tad Williams, and we look at stuff like David Eddings and some of these things that were really popular in the 80s, they're all on a quest. There's often an elf-ish race or an elfish culture. There's often a dwarfish race or a dwarfish culture. There's a magical item that and there's some really excellent fantasy. I mean, I've mentioned Terry Brooks, and it feels like a lot of these were Tolkien dropped like the coolest thing ever, and then said, and I'm done. Deal with that world. And so hugely in his shadow. And then the generation that I am is the people, so that generation kind of did a lot of very Tolkien-esque. My generation responded against.
Yes.
And I think responding against can be as flattering, I hope. It's not like I'm like, oh, Tolkien was so awful. It was, look,
Gotta do something
we've
different.
got to take this genre new places. We can't spend forever in his shadow. In fact, that really started with the second generation, with the end of it, with Robin Hobb and George Martin, and even Robert Jordan, who the first 3 books of Robert Jordan are very Tolkien.
similar. Yeah.
Yeah, right. You've got straight up ring wraiths. You've got straight up right, and then you get to book 4, and suddenly it's a political intrigue, giant kind of political mess like Game of Thrones, which was also came out a few years later.
Right.
That's what people were really getting interested in, and then Robin Hobb and some of these people take it a different direction. Like the whole Assassin's Apprentice story is about what if Frodo, but he ran away, right? That's kind of what those are and things like that. Like anyway. So what am I? I respond kind of against. Tolkien has this sort of sorrowful feel that permeates a lot of these. It is the time of elves is past.
Yes.
They are sailing away. The time of men is here, and men are slowly becoming less awesome.
Yes.
Right?
Magic is like dying.
Magic is dying, and the world is becoming a new world, and it's like there is some hope for a new world, right?
Yes.
That's worlds die and are reborn and things like that.
Yeah.
And obviously that became the theme of the Wheel of Time, is that, magic is going away and technology is coming, is kind of how you view that, and that's Tolkien. So I am one of the core themes of my stories is magic is returning.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
These are stories about worlds where it's time for the magic to come back. And the other big theme is magic as science. And right, like if magic exists, we should be able to make it something we can understand and replicate its effects.
Yeah.
It's kind of the anti-Gandalf, right? Gandalf, I mean, Tolkien knew what Gandalf could do and why.
Yes.
But I'm talking about like as it's presented to the reader.
Right.
We would call Gandalf, I usually use as my example of kind of the ultimate soft magic.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Because his job in the story is to make the hobbits feel small, not just physically, but also in terms of the grand context.
Yes.
There are things going on you don't understand. This is a foe beyond you.
Yes.
I can fight this thing, you cannot.
Right.
That is Gandalf's purpose.
And we don't know, Gandalf's like, wow, I'm worn out.
Yeah.
And that was one thing that stuck out to me when I started reading your books is, I never thought something like we're running out of pewter. I was like, oh my gosh, like I know what that means. It's such a difference to like have that understanding, and I think it's a very interesting storytelling experience to be on the inside, so to speak, of the magic.
Now, I will say that Tolkien also has the first great hard magic system, which is the One Ring.
Oh, yeah.
Because a really good hard magic system is about a couple of things. It's about you can replicate an effect, but it has a cost. And that cost over time should have a deep influence on the story.
Yeah.
And the One Ring is actually the example I use of a really great, simple concept, deep usage hard magic system. You put on the ring, you become invisible. That's really handy in the short term.
Yes.
You will pay a cost, both in your, by being around the ring, by being further corrupted, and by certain things can see you and get to you if you are using the One Ring that couldn't otherwise. And so, distinct cost. It's used very effectively in the story over and over again as showing off, and it becomes narratively key to the whole thing. It is the perfect soft magic system and the perfect hard magic system in one story. And that's one of the things I love about Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry, I will nerd out on magic systems and the history of fantasy all day.
I've watched enough of your podcasts to I get sucked into it very easily because I find it very interesting. One of the things that I really appreciate about your books is, there's obviously violence and darkness and everything, but you don't revel in it. I'm guessing that's it's not gratuitous. Is that
Right.
I'm guessing that's a conscious.
It is.
decision.
It's just what I like to write.
Yeah.
I definitely think that some very dark things make for really great stories.
Yeah.
My favorite short story of all time is Harrison Bergeron, which is it's Kurt Vonnegut. It's a kick to the face, and things like that. So I definitely am glad that the genre has room for grimdark and non-grimdark.
Yeah.
But where I, instead of reacting against Tolkien, react toward Tolkien, is that in the epic fantasy sort of line, you've got the George R.R. Martin, which took it grimdark, and he's really, I think George would say, he's a combination of heroic and epic. He's kind of taking heroic sensibilities from that line of, magic is evil, not evil, magic is dangerous, and it's going to destroy you, and you can't really know what it will do, and it's about soldiers doing their best, but they mess up a lot, and you don't really know who the heroes and villains often are. But he put epic fantasy sort of narrative structure upon that aesthetic, and that's Game of Thrones. And that kicked off a whole bunch of grimdark. I would definitely say that where I respond toward Tolkien is in that sort of things are awful, but there is light on the horizon. Look for me on the morning. Is it what I always get the number of days wrong, but in Gandalf
Third
returns.
day.
It's not actually the third. Is it the third?
Oh.
It would be. It's mythologically important for it to be the third, like with the
You're right,
Christ
yes.
metaphor. So I always say it is, but I think it's actually not, and it always trips me up. So
Hey guys, Matt from the future here. I just had to clarify this. While in the films, Gandalf shows up at dawn on the 5th day with Éomer. This is actually one of those rare instances where the films stretch rather than condense the timeline. In the books, Gandalf leaves the Rohirrim when they discover Saruman has an army heading their way on March 2nd. And it's the very next morning, March 3rd, that he shows up at Helm's Deep with Erkenbrand. All right, that out of the way, back to the interview.
I'm sure you've been asked a million times just this weekend about a Cosmere cinematic adaptation.
Yes.
And I've watched enough of your podcast to know, and something I really appreciate is it's very clear that making money on the IP, as they say, is not your highest on your priority list.
We've done well enough that we don't have to care.
Yes, and I love that. So I'm curious to look at this from a different perspective. What is high on your priority list when it comes to?
That's been a question I'm asking myself a lot lately, because ever since the Kickstarter, my cachet in Hollywood has increased. If you're not aware, I had a very big Kickstarter
Very
a few years
big,
ago.
yes.
Years ago. And what I really want is I want a filmmaker with passion for the material and talent to do it justice. Now, I don't know how contentious the Peter Jackson films are on your channel, right?
I think they're pretty positive.
Pretty positive. People are all right with the change, to Sam leaving and to Aragorn's character.
There's
and,
definitely a range of how okay you are with some of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I tend to be very okay with the changes, but I consider myself a Tolkien fan, but not a Tolkien scholar. And so I consider the gold standard of yes, in the books Sam never left and Frodo never got mad at him, but cinematically
you can understand why.
You can understand why, and also he's condensing so many words into a few scenes that it gets the same emotion by actually heightening it, And I'm okay with Aragorn kind of having more of an uncertainty about being king because I'm sure he did at some point.
At some point, yes.
But he's past that by the time the books start. But I feel like these sorts of changes really worked. And you also have kind of a great vision. Now, if I were made Lord of the Rings, would I include some of those kind of horror scenes that come from Peter Jackson's horror background, where he really likes when the heads get chopped off?
Yes.
I don't know if I would. But he had a vision and a passion and knew the property and was a really skilled filmmaker.
Yes.
We're seeing the same thing in Dune. Dune is the same sort of gold standard. Yes, there's changes. But I think that the visionary filmmaker plus a sincere love of the source material has a couple of times led to just genius works.
Yes.
I need that. And the problem with that is you can't invent that.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
You can't just go to Spielberg, who is, I think, our greatest living filmmaker, and if he doesn't have passion for the topic.
Right.
Right.
You can't make him have
can't
passion.
make
Yeah.
him have passion for it. Though Spielberg did you see the news? He's maybe doing Old Man's War, which is such a
Oh,
perfect
no, I
match for
didn't know
him.
that.
I don't know if you've read that book,
I
but
haven't,
Old
no.
Man's War is great, and Scalzi's a friend, and this is a really good match for Spielberg. So I'm excited by that. But regardless, that's what I want. I want that filmmaker who has their really powerful, but it's so hard to match somebody like that with actually a passion for the source material.
Yes, yeah.
I feel like a lot of them will go way off board because they are creative people who want to make
Yeah.
their own story rather than that. And so,
Yes, yeah.
you know, like when Nolan made The Prestige.
Oh, yeah.
The Prestige.
Yeah.
He did. I'm just doing books to film.
Yeah,
The
okay,
Prestige
yeah.
book and the Prestige film are just both
Really good. Yeah, I really
chef's
like that one.
kiss.
Yeah.
So that's what I want.
Yeah.
Where I can't manufacture that.
Right, yeah.
And it's so hard in Hollywood to tell if someone's telling you the truth
Yeah.
when they say I am that.
Yes.
So yeah.
Now, we're just have a couple minutes here, so I have a lightning-ish round
Okay,
that I
let's
like
do
to
it.
do with people. Favorite Tolkien book?
Favorite Tolkien book is probably Two Towers.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Favorite Middle-earth character?
Favorite Middle-earth character. I mean, I'm gonna be so cliched, right? It's Sam.
Yeah.
Is it anyone? Does anyone say anyone other than Sam?
Oh yeah, we
Okay.
get a variety.
You get a variety.
Yeah,
Okay. Well,
yeah.
it's Sam.
Sam, that's a great choice though. Favorite Middle-earth location?
Favorite Middle-earth location. Wow. There's a lot of good
There
ones.
are, yeah.
So that's tough because I'm going to go with Helm's Deep just because it is the best example of that narrative structure that
Yeah.
I've ever found, and I just love it. So, and it feels, it's so dark, and it's so So Helm's Deep.
That's
we'll
a
go
good
with
one.
Helm's Deep.
This next one's from my 13-year-old. Is when will the next Mistborn book come out?
Next Mistborn book, so I'm writing it starting in January.
Oh, great.
And I'm not going to release it till I have all 3 of this next trilogy
Okay.
written. So it depends on how long it takes me to write all 3. Then we'll start revisions and get the first one out. So it might be 3 or 4 years.
Okay, good to know. Okay, last question. This might be a little silly, but Stormlight books in particular, you're known for these big, thick books. I'm curious, do you ever have nightmares that Ents are real? And that they're going to come for you?
They're going to come for me. Well, these days, fortunately for the Ents, the majority of my books are sold in audiobook and ebook. That said, Treebeard, my grandfather was a lumberjack. So if you're coming for anybody, I mean, it might be me. I come from a line of lumberjacks for several generations. So,
Well, Brandon, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I've loved diving into your world. Just been inhaling the books. Like I said, my 13-year-old's a huge fan now too, and he's been inhaling the books. And I'm now, a Sander fan, as they say, and I think I'm going to be a little bit of a Sander evangelist, if I can coin that term, to my audience here, because it's just a wonderful series, and I think it's a great overlap. The fandom of Tolkien and your fandom. There's a lot of people in both boats here that I've met.
well,
so.
thank you, Matt. I appreciate coming on the channel.